So we are back with part 2 of the psychology of totalitarianism. I believe where we left it off at the end of the last podcast was we were talking about this idea of the mechanistic worldview of science and how it's come to pervade all our thinking. It got pretty deep in there. I mean, we only got 3 chapters into this book within about 2 hours. So we're going to try and up the pace today because a lot of the topics in the rest of the book are sort of based off the arguments or the areas we were covering in the part 1.
Yeah.
So actually, I would say probably if somebody is jumping into it at this point, they probably should go back and listen to the first part.
Kind of just sets a foundation for it.
Yeah, exactly that. Like the history of science, how it's moved from, a way of thinking and a way of like creating ignorance to almost a sort of ideological worldview now, where everything's just if you've got numbers, it's scientific kind of sort of viewpoint, isn't it? It's crazy how it's come so far from where it originally set off to be and what it originally set off to sort of to obtain in terms of like the whole point, like the whole like essence of science is to create this idea of self-doubt, whereas now all we seem to create is certainty.
Yeah. No, precisely. Well put.
But yeah, so we are going to start today with chapter 4, and it was called The Immeasurable, with a little bracket. So it was meant to be the measurable, but it's immeasurable universe. So this chapter delves into the methodology employed by the mechanistic ideology to acquire knowledge. At the core of this ideology lies the belief that the universe operates like a machine with measurable components. Measurements and calculations serve as a foundation for mechanistic research methods. This epistemological standpoint also influences the ideology's vision of an ideal society. In this ideal society, decision-making is entrusted to expert technocrats who rely on objective numerical data. The recent coronavirus crisis served as a prime example, bringing the pursuit of this utopian ideal tantalizingly close. Therefore, the crisis offers a compelling case study for subjecting our trust in measurements and numbers to critical examination.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And I think we saw a huge amount of that during COVID. This whole idea of I'm not going to trust my reality or my perception or what I actually see. Instead, I'm just going to delegate it to or abdicate it to, these kind of, what do they say? Almost technocrats. Yeah. Because they know best, because they have these algorithms that can apparently just squeeze all of life and make one number. And yeah, it's just amazing the kind of how willing I found people were to do that, to just like they could see something, but it's like, oh, but I don't know whether what I'm seeing is actually true because someone hasn't told me that it's true yet. It's like, just use your fucking senses.
Yeah. Yeah,
So,
I just think I think it's once again the point of it, which scares me a little bit, is this idea that you using sort of like arcane mathematical or like formulas and just gives this whole idea of like certainty that just because it's been measured, it's been quantified, it's objective.
Yeah.
But like as we well know from the art of lying with statistics and stuff, it equally what matters is how the data is collected in the first place.
100%.
And then also the data isn't. I mean, obviously the data you can argue is kind of like the facts, let's just say, right? But there's multiple interpretations of why the data is moving in certain directions, right? There's it lacks the explanatory reason. I think we were talking about this last time. I can't remember if we were exactly. It was like numbers, fine, they give you sort of like a sense of like certainty or like of a set point, but they don't explain why the numbers are there in the first place, right? That requires reason. And it can't.
And the whole context is gone behind it. Yeah. So then on that point, the new data-driven society. Prior to the recent crisis, societies were predominantly governed by narratives rather than numerical data. These narratives took the form of myths, religious beliefs, and later political stories. However, the mechanistic ideology challenges the reliance on narratives because they are viewed as inherently irrational and subjective. According to this ideology, stories reveal more about their authors than any objective reality they attempt to represent. The emergence of the coronavirus crisis presented an unexpected opportunity for the mechanistic ideology. The uncertainty and fear surrounding the virus provided fertile ground for the formation of a society where decisions are driven by numbers instead of narratives. Currently, the focus is on simple numerical data such as infection rates, hospitalizations, and deaths. However, in the future, we may witness the use of advanced biometric data that meticulously maps every aspect of human physical function. Unlike words, numbers provide an objective foundation for transparent and rational decision-making. They offer a means to counteract abuses of power and irrationality, while also minimizing human suffering. This vision presents a path towards a rational society of the future where data, objectivity, and accuracy reign, leading the reduction of suffering. In this context, the coronavirus crisis could be seen as the pinnacle achievement of humanity, or so the story goes.
So I think just the only comment I kind of want to make on this before we even get into the downside of numbers is this idea that, that numbers can provide rational decision making is like, it's almost becomes like, I think we've talked about it before on the podcast, like absolutely ages ago, the idea of like plausible deniability from, I think it was the elephant in the brain, I believe was the one who came up with it. But like this idea that you can almost use then numbers to just be like, oh, this is what the numbers said. Therefore, if I take this decision and obviously it's catastrophic, it doesn't I can blame it on the numbers because it's not my fault. I made the best decision based on the numbers I had. And then it comes to the question of like, once again, like we just said, how are these numbers recorded, right? As in fact, we'll get onto it in a second, because obviously when it comes to sort of recording data, you can change definitions of certain things to increase the amount of, for example, in this case, like hospital deaths, right? They were like COVID deaths. They were just basically saying anybody who died when they had COVID was therefore a COVID death, when like you could have had COVID and got hit by a bus.
Well, it's absolutely. It's kind of funny because I remember Jordan Peterson always says this, that like science is nested within a narrative itself, right? And almost on a micro level, you could say the same thing about how this data was used. For instance, they kept changing the definition of what data, like what, a coronavirus death was. And that in itself is a narrative with which the data is then nested into. Because if I change the definition of like, oh, well, a coronavirus death is someone who's been, who's had a positive test, right? Then it's really broad. But if I say, oh no, they must have been,
they had to die
beforehand,
they had to die from the actual symptomology of the disease, like
and it's and it just goes to show you that like, we can, we're almost constructing, we can use data in multiple different angles, from multiple different things. I think he even touched on it in this book that a graph can be read 100 different ways, and that's normally to justify the individual's kind of agenda to an extent.
So the next, we've got the downside of numbers. So numbers possess a distinct psychological power, as they can create an almost irresistible perception of objectivity. This illusion is further strengthened when numbers are visually presented through charts or graphs. When individuals encounter numbers, they tend to perceive them as concrete objects or indisputable facts. However, this illusion prevents people from recognizing the underlying reality, that numbers are inherently relative and ambiguous. They are constructed and shaped by subjective and ideological narratives, as you were just saying. While numbers may initially appear to reflect objective truths, a closer examination reveals that they obediently serve the agendas of various stories. This realization unveils the inherent subjectivity and malleability of numbers. Despite their outward appearance of factual precision, numbers are intricately intertwined with the stories they are associated with.
Yeah. It's interesting.
It is. I think a concrete example helps, doesn't it? So like as we get onto the coronavirus, it kind of explains it better.
No, exactly. Okay, so analyzing the coronavirus crisis. The coronavirus crisis can be seen as a continuation of the earlier crisis in academia, albeit now unfolding openly in the public sphere. The problems that had previously emerged within academia were now on a full display in the mass media, captivating the attention of the world. Many people found it hard to believe what they witnessed as scientists at the highest level contradicted themselves and their peers, made simple calculation errors, and changed their positions hastily. Numbers played a pivotal role in this unfolding saga. At its core, the coronavirus crisis involved calculating relatively straightforward phenomena such as the number of infections, hospitalizations, and deaths. However, it became evident that the data being presented were far from objective. The count of infections, for instance, relied heavily on the PCR tests, which were not without their issues. These tests aim to detect the presence of viral RNA sequences in the body. However, these sequences could originate from either an active and contagious virus or from a dead virus. Consequently, individuals could still test positive even months after an infection, long after they posed a risk of transmission. This was just one of the many limitations associated with the tests. Another challenge arose when estimating changes in infection rates based on the rate of positive test results. Public health experts who spoke to the media about infection trends often neglected to account for the total number of tests conducted. Instead, they reported the absolute number of positive tests, failing to provide the context of the positivity ratio. In the summer of 2020, Bernard Rentier, a virologist and former rector of the University of Liège, critically analyzed raw data related to the so-called summer wave, then referred to as the second wave. His analysis revealed that after adjusting for the total number of tests performed, the estimated number of infections was between 20 to 70 times lower than what was being reported in the media.
So yeah, I mean, I don't know if we ever read the book together, and if we didn't, we should definitely do it on this podcast as soon as possible. It's called Risk Savvy by Gerd Gigerenzer. He was one of the guys who came up with like the heuristic stuff. He talks a lot in his book about the difference between absolute and relative increases, because obviously if you're testing more, you're more likely to get more positive like results, right? Yeah. And this is the whole point here, where they basically, what they've done is they said, oh, wow, we had this many people positive this week. We had this many people positive this week, without failing to account for it's meant to be a percentage of the amount of people who did the test to be representative of how many people actually have it as a population, right? And he talks a lot about that in his book. And he talks especially about like medical risks and stuff. Yeah. Because they said they'll do stuff like, 50% reduction in this or 100% reduction in this, and then it's like taken at an absolute level, not a relative, or vice versa. It's taken at a relative level, like it's gone down. It's gone down like 1, but it was out of 2, so therefore it's a 50% reduction. Yeah, and like that's how you like massage this, like the statistics to just say what you want to say, right? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I thought it was super interesting.
It is. It just goes to show you like how complex these things actually are. I mean, this kind of just described a process of, from testing to a death, essentially. But all of the points along that and how complex each of those points are. I mean, I remember reading about how many cycles they did the PCR test. So you would have a PCR test and it would put it in like a little, tube. It would spin it, and the amount of cycles determines how like micro level it can analyze. Okay. But there's like there's a standard amount, right? Which is like, I'm going to butcher this, but let's say 17 cycles, and they were analyzing it to like 28. So you're like looking for something, right? It's method driven. It's like, it's once again, it's that narrative. You're going to find something if you choose to find something. And so we're going to change the parameters in which we can identify the thing that we want to identify. And in this case, it's just another example of how much more complex this stuff is, and yet it's portrayed as incredibly simple. And it's like, this is what's happening. This is the number that we found, Yeah, I mean, once again, I don't know if all these things are necessarily nefarious or just based from from negligence almost. Like, I mean, we both know from our university experiences doing like research projects, you kind of like get like a rough crash course in statistics, but you never really get taught any more than that, and you kind of just get expected to like know it almost. And I think it's one of those things that if you really think about it, like, okay, we had this many people testing positive this week, and now we have this many people testing positive. Look at that massive increase. It logically, if you don't put your like critical hat on for 2 seconds, it like makes sense. Precisely, it's massively increased. Look, wow, we've now got this many people with it. Yeah. But it's obviously, once again, as if you put on a critical hat, you think, okay, right, well, back then we had this many people being tested. Therefore, the percentage of people who were tested is like 20%. And now we've tested like 1 million people. And now it's way lower. It's only 10% of the population actually have it. Although it's absolutely increased,
the percentage hasn't increased, and therefore you can't argue that it's increasing as a percentage of the population, right? But it's one of those things. It just takes the next level of like of thinking, I guess, to some degree. And I guess that's what you would argue, or you would hope that people at the top are actually going through and critically analyzing all of this, right? Like, because once again, if they are the technocrats making decisions based off the data, you'd want the data to be one, like the most accurate as possible, and then also two, like thinking about it and making sure that they're thinking about it in like a multi-dimensional way, not just, you know, absolute increase, etc. But then once again, this is where the conspiratorial sort of aspect comes in, where people sort of go then, like, why is the incompetence there? Like, why is it? It's almost like you said, it's like pushing a narrative. It's like, okay, well, if we can show the absolute, it obviously it promotes the narrative that it's getting worse, rather than it promotes the narrative that it's getting better. And then there's also that, like, I think I want to say it's Taleb or somebody, they call it like the precautionary principle, whereas like he almost like tries to justify actions like this because it's like it's better to take precaution than it is to like throw caution to the wind. So for example, with this, he would say something along the lines of, even though obviously the relative percentage was going down, he wouldn't want the general population to know that, to then start behaving in a way that would promote spread more. So it's almost more like we're going to massage the data for the greater good. But once again, this is where
what is the greater good?
This is where this is where the problem becomes, is like who decides what's best for the population. Right? And then I'm sure they might have even had models where it's like, right, actually, 1 second, if we go back to the way we live, this is going to be a transmission rate, boom, boom, boom. So like we need to make sure people aren't doing this for the next whatever. So we need to keep the momentum going that it's getting worse, so people are scared. So there is reasons for it, right? This is one of the things that I think is like wrestling with this idea of like, it isn't just a clean narrative of like government intervention, destroy society, bad. It's like, yes, it has caused loads of these bad effects, but in my head, they were probably doing it for reasons unknown to us that they had maybe more understanding of, I don't know, or more information about, right? Because like, once again, like with all this stuff, we've kind of just taken the data that they've supplied to the public at face value. But if they already have the mindset of protecting the public at all costs, then there could be levels of hiding actual realities to some degree.
And it becomes a kind of moral question. It's like, well, when do you tell the truth, or, you know, how do you get to determine what you should tell the truth about or not? And I wonder, like, going off your point, I don't think it's necessarily always nefarious, but I think it does beg the question of requiring people to think critically about something, like you were saying, but that requires energy and like cognitive energy, and people are, and it goes back to what we were talking about in the first part of this, as in like, what is science? Well, science is difficult because you have to actively go looking for the truth. It's not about just following a method. And I feel like if there is a procedure that people follow, and especially when like things are quite hectic, you almost want some level of comfort, some security, and that might be like a kind of procedure that is normally prescribed, even if the procedure that you're following is not like actually showing you the results. You know, you're not actually like getting results from it. You're just following it for the sake of it. And I wonder how much that happens up top in the, you know, where people have kind of abdicated thinking critically about something because something's so hectic, and so we'll just follow this procedure because I know. And also, once again, it's like, I'm not held accountable if something goes wrong, because I'm just following all the procedures. And I think that probably comes into it a lot, right? Like,
it's fun. It's funny. I think I remember telling you about that book. I could butcher the title. Lying for Money, I think it's called, where it talks a lot about the different stages of fraud. And it's like the individual fraud where I commit fraud against you. Then it's like collective fraud, I commit fraud against a bunch of people. Then there's like the worst type of fraud, where it's like everybody commits fraud. And this one does the most damage, but the system is fraudulent, if that makes sense. Like everybody's committing it, but because it's the system, nobody like finds it until it's too late. And it kind of reminds me of that a little bit, because once again, the system itself could be relatively fraudulent, or it like doing a bad thing, but because everybody justifies the system to doing the thing in the first place, they don't ever critically evaluate, are we going in the right direction? Is the system correct?
Exactly.
Whatever. It's just like, let's follow procedure. And it's like, oh, I'm going to tell you off of this. It's like, well, I just followed the procedure. Like, I just followed the manual. It's like,
and it's not until there's such undeniable evidence that the procedure is wrong that it then gets changed, right? or you have someone come in who
post-analysis, like you said, post-analysis of the procedure reveals these were the consequences. Oh wow, like this is actually not better than the things it was meant to be stopping from happening, so therefore we need to redevelop the procedure. But I mean, that takes also independent regulatory bodies to do stuff like that, because once again, if you get somebody with a skin in the game or like incentives to like not find anything, they're not going to find something, are they? Which is the whole point of like independent like regulators, right? It's you don't ask your friend if you're like, I don't know, you look good today. You ask somebody who doesn't have a stake in your success or mental health, who's just going to absolutely. That's why internet trolls. I mean, I'm not saying they're good for anything, but they're going to tell you as it is or as they see it.
No, that's true.
But the subjectivity of data. So the data concerning hospital admissions during the coronavirus crisis were highly subjective and relative. Any patient who tested positive upon admission, regardless of their symptoms, was categorized as a COVID-19 patient, which is interesting. So even if their reason for admission had nothing to do with the virus, such as a broken leg. However, the Scottish government altered their methodology at one point and began considering someone as a coronavirus patient only if they tested positive and were admitted with COVID-19 symptoms. This change resulted in a significant reduction, leaving only 13% of the original number of COVID-19 patients. I mean, that first of all, that just makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like in terms of when you change it from a blanket rule of anybody who has it in hospital is admitted for this, it's just crazy. It's crazy logic. It's such a stretch.
It's crazy logic, right? Like that is crazy. You
Which is why there's a conspiratorial. For example, right, we are just taking this guy's word from it in the book. I need to see the stats.
Yeah, of course.
The methodology. But all I'm saying is, if this is the case, then like there is such a stretch of logic. It's very hard to be like, oh wow, they must have been in like sound mind to decide this is the policy or the method.
I mean, also you've got fucking doctors who are intelligent people, and people are coming into the hospital and they've tested positive, but they've got, a broken leg. And it's like, surely it's it's
a COVID patient. But once again, I guess, okay, so it really depends here. So before we continue this, I get it from the perspective of like trying to diagnose how many people as a collective have COVID.
Mm-hmm.
So technically the mission here is not to say that he's come in with hospitalization. Oh, wait, is it actually hospitalization? Okay,
I think
it is. Okay, fine. I was about to say, okay, that changes it then. If it was just trying to count how many people total are COVID, it kind of makes sense to like test people. And then if they came into hospital with COVID, it's like, okay, he's a COVID person. Yeah. And therefore we now know the absolute number of people who have COVID. Yeah. You're right. If it is to do with like hospitalizations with COVID, not because of COVID, it does leave it like, once again, this is it, massaging the numbers. Was the hospitalization data presented as hospitalization with COVID or from COVID? Because these are two very different things. So similarly, the data surrounding death counts, which is considered one of the most fundamental variables, turned out to be far from unambiguous. Approximately 95% of registered COVID-19 deaths were associated with one or more underlying conditions. According to the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, only about 6% of deaths were attributed solely to COVID-19, without any other underlying conditions. Moreover, the majority of coronavirus victims were elderly, with an average age of 83 during the first wave in Belgium, slightly exceeding the average life expectancy. This raises the question of how one determines whether someone died from COVID if an elderly person in poor health contracts the virus and subsequently passes away. Is it accurate to attribute their death solely to the virus, or did other factors contribute as well? All of this is to say that the most basic numbers in the coronavirus crisis are not objective data. They are constructed on the basis of subjective assumptions and agreements. Depending on how these agreements are made, the numbers can differ by a factor of no less than 15 or even 20. And that point there, is just like super important with this idea that subjective assumptions and agreements is kind of true, is like subjective definitions, let's just say, as well as a better way of probably thinking of it, like how are we defining the things that we're measuring? And therefore, if we stretch the definition, we can change, like depending on how strict the definition is, depends on the number count, right? Like we saw from the hospital admissions. Have you come here because your symptoms have made you incapable of living outside of the hospital? Okay, you are admitted to hospital. I would wonder as well if people who went to hospital just because they were worried that they had it were counted as hospital admissions.
Oh,
as well, right?
100%. Yeah.
So it's one of these things that, like, there's a severity difference between like being on life support and just getting a checkup in hospital because you're really scared, because obviously everybody was scared at the time, right?
Yeah.
I feel like there's a difference there, which maybe or might not be reflected by the statistics.
Yeah.
And they were taking very general variables, which just captured a large amount of people rather than the very specific amount of people which actually mattered, such as how many people are on like life support. Also, then there's a question of like per age. Then it's a question of underlying health conditions as well, because as we well know, if you're like sort of vulnerable because of other health impairments, you're going to be more likely to die from anything, let alone COVID. You know, it's one of those things.
It's what old people die of, like the flu.
Yeah,
the flu is the is the thing that finishes a lot of older people off, and it's so. Yeah. All right. So on to the next part. Alternative explanations for the same phenomena. For example, the ICUs were clearly overloaded by COVID-19 patients, weren't they? That's correct. But the way in which we should interpret that fact is another question. Rather than an indication of COVID-19's exceptional danger, the overload seems to be the result of two colliding trends over recent decades. One, a sharp rise in susceptibility to developing serious symptoms in viral lung diseases in a major part of the population, especially people suffering from obesity and diabetes. And two, systematic reduction in ICU beds. The upward trend in the number of patients at risk and downward trend in the number of ICU beds inevitably had to cross sooner or later. So the burden on hospitals can be interpreted as proof of the virus's extreme threat, but it can equally be interpreted as a symptom of inadequate management, progressive reduction of hospital beds, for example, or as a result of declining health, such as high obesity and diabetes, or as the result of the coronavirus measures themselves, that is, an influx of anxious people increasing in psychosomatic complaints, like you just said, people worrying that they have something so they go head to the hospital. Depending on the interpretation, radically divergent policies need to be followed.
This is just, it's just such an interesting point. And I just can't imagine anybody who really thinks about it. Like, obviously, I get that some people might disagree with some of the stuff this guy's saying, and fair enough, because they might believe everything they're being told and stuff. And there's nothing wrong with that to some degree. It's just like, you can't argue against there could be alternative explanations that make equally as much sense, if not more.
Yeah.
Like, to be honest, half of these, and the reason why half of these make sense as well is because they fit into this narrative of, obviously, especially in the UK, the NHS like failing us a little bit, right? And obviously strapped for cash, etc. Right? So reductions in ICU beds would make sense that they'd be overloaded then. So like saying, oh my god, these people are having to like sit on the floor, whatever, they couldn't get an ICU bed. Because there was less ICU beds is a very good explanation too. Obviously, that's less ICU beds plus more people being ill because of it, right? I'm not arguing that more people weren't ill because of the COVID virus. I think that'd be stupid to argue against that. Or even just another flu. Do you get what I mean? It's just like
But this is one of the things that has been
people are ill. Yeah,
it's been a recurring problem. I remember reading around it that the flu, it fluctuates, right? So one year it might be really strong, and the next year it might be really like it's not that strong. Not many people die from it. When it is strong, there is an influx of patients, there's an overboarding of patients, and there aren't enough beds. It's the same thing that literally happened during COVID. It's not like it only happened with COVID. And that's what's really interesting, is because it's almost like the past is neglected. And it is very kind of Orwellian in that sense, because then you get to define the current, the present. You say, oh no, we've always been fine. We've always had enough beds. But it was the main, like, think about how often you saw it in the newspapers during COVID, them talking about how filled the hospitals were. But they, weren't saying that was the case, 2 years prior.
Yeah, I was just gonna add on that the COVID crisis almost like made us zoom in on the health system even more and analyze it even more. Like you're just saying, this sort of stuff was happening beforehand. And therefore, but this wasn't in the media. Like if the realities of maybe the health service and the declining health has been well documented in the population, people would have probably searched for these explanations as well as other things. Because once again, what people know is what they see and what they read and what they hear. Therefore, I mean, that's equally us, right? Like half the reason we have these opinions because we're reading around all these books which give alternative explanations, right? But like these people as well, like if they're not seeing the fact that there's been a reduction in the amount of ICU or hospital beds available over the course of years, and they'll just use it as an excuse, like not as an excuse, sorry, but as a reasoning, like, oh wow, I've just seen the COVID and nobody's got a bed. But like you said, if that happened 2 years ago and it wasn't put on the media, people didn't realize that was already a problem.
Exactly.
You know?
Yeah.
And it was already being caused by other things, like other spikes. Because I mean, they even say stuff like I can't remember who it was. I think it was somebody working in a hospital. They were talking about this idea of spiking on the weekends when people get drunk. Like the amount of people who are in hospital because of drunkenness and drunken disorderly behavior and injuries related to drunkenness. So like the hospitals get busy on like Friday nights and Saturday nights just because of drunken mistakes, drunken behavior. And it's just like this sort of thing. Like there is reasons behind it. Like obviously COVID is one of them, but there's also other things, like other multifactorial things that cause these things. Like, for example, if we had a really well-funded National Health Service, which had built into it like extra scope for having more beds than necessary, we might not even heard this.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? If we were well prepared in the sense that we always have like a 20% more than we need ICU beds just for spikes.
Yeah.
We would be fine. Think about all these like pop-up hospitals they were creating to try and service the increased demand, you know? So could the remedy have been the problem? So excess mortality is often considered a key factor of the severity of COVID-19. By comparing the number of deaths during the pandemic to previous years, one might assume it provides an objective measure. However, even this seemingly objective data is subject to inherent subjectivity and has been overlooked in the analysis. Excess mortality does not necessarily reflect virus-related deaths alone. It can also be influenced by collateral damage resulting from the mitigation measures themselves, such as reduced immunity, delayed treatment, and the negative impact on mental health leading to suicide, depression, addiction, poverty, and starvation. Additionally, the treatment methods employed may contribute to the overall mortality figures. For instance, during the lockdowns in 2020, thousands of elderly individuals in Dutch residential care settings suffered from loneliness and neglect, resulting in their untimely deaths. Furthermore, a German study suggested that approximately half of the high mortality in ICUs during the first wave was due to widespread use of intubation (brackets ventilation), a protocol that was later reconsidered and modified due to its counterproductiveness. While it is challenging to ascertain the precise accuracy of these numbers, it prompts us to question what the mortality graphs would look like if adjusted for these factors. The following might be the most inconvenient truth of the entire crisis: that we have caused the misery that has been so dramatized in the media, mass media, down on ourselves to a large extent, that the remedy itself has become a significant part of the problem. Another flaw in the numerical approach to the coronavirus crisis is the overlooking of collateral damage caused by the measures implemented. The lack of publicly available data and statistics on the number of victims affected by delayed treatment, suicide, vaccination issues, food insecurity, and economic disruption is striking. Scientific articles and press releases have consistently highlighted these risks since the beginning. It is concerning that society as a whole can disregard the fundamental question of medicine. Are we certain that the cure is not more harmful than the disease itself? And that's a super interesting one. I mean, there was a lot of people complaining about missing operations because they weren't allowed to have their checkups as well. Routine checkups were sort of cancelled and stuff. You know, so how many people who missed diagnoses? For other things because COVID was ongoing. And it's a valid question to ask. Like you don't once again, cause and effects, consequences. Something happens, other trickle down effects happen because of this change. And what's more dramatic to change than nobody seeing each other for a couple of weeks? Being locked in your own house. A
couple of weeks, man, a year and a half essentially.
Yeah, well. What was it what was the phrase for if you're was it compulsory worker? Key worker. It was key worker, wasn't it? I've already forgotten.
Key worker, unless you're a key worker.
Yeah, that was it.
Yeah. Well, exactly. It's I mean, I remember looking at some graphs very early on COVID and talking about the deaths of despair prediction, like how many people would die as a result of the what they implement to stop COVID. And I've seen some podcasts that say that the deaths have actually been a lot more than the actual COVID deaths in general. But I think fundamentally, once again, it depends on what your definition of the crisis is, right? If we're defining COVID as this, when realistically it's this, right? It's a lot more complex. Then if you only provide a solution that is just for this, then you're going to be missing out on everything else. It's going to be an inaccurate solution. It's not going to account for all the other complexities which we've just touched on. And so there's naturally going to be there's going to be, like you said, a trickle-down effect, all these other things that are being neglected, which are the fact that people do have to interact. I mean, look at there's a huge crisis now with children because they've been deprived of school for 2 years, I mean, if you think that your kid's 5 or 7, 2 years is a large portion of their life, right? It's not for us, but it is for them.
And it's a very important developmental window.
It's a critical period. Yeah, absolutely. And that's just one thing. But it just goes to show you, depending on how you define the problem, then it determines what solution you have. But normally that solution will disregard all the complexity if the definition is too strict. All right, so on to the next section. So number selection matters. Stories make the numbers rather than the other way round. That's what is the issue. The case of Great Britain's border measurement serves as a prime example of how measurements are inherently relative and contingent upon the chosen measurement unit. Simpson's paradox further illustrates that even seemingly straightforward and accurate numbers can lead to divergent interpretations. The reality is that anyone can cherry-pick numbers that align with their own biases and manipulate their interpretation to support their subjective ideological narratives. The pervasive illusion that numbers inherently represent indisputable facts intensifies individuals' conviction that their own constructed fiction mirrors reality, amplifying the divide between various perspectives. But how is it possible for researchers to fall prey to their subjective prejudices? The explanation can be found, in part, among the following issues. Every research procedure requires countless choices for which there are no strictly logical grounds. Which measuring instrument will I use? How will I interpret the measurements? How do I deal with missing data? And so on. From the vast array of possibilities, researchers unconsciously choose options that will ensure the results they deem desirable.
Yes, I mean, yeah, it does make sense. As we said before, with all this data stuff, it's how you collect it, how you're measuring it, how you're defining it, that actually matters more than the actual data itself. And I think we as a collective forget that 90% of the time. It's easy to change the numbers if you change the definition and make it way more widespread or way more open to increase the amount. A bit like we were saying here with the logical stretch of hospital admissions with COVID. Okay, is it with or from? There's a complete difference there. But if you bundle the two together, obviously you're going to have an increase in the total amount, and therefore it's going to seem more severe. And this is also why I quite like this. There's an idea before as well, which is I think it could have been factfulness, mate. I think it was where he talks about not just taking one number. He talks about comparing numbers, right? He's he's don't just ever take one. Make sure you get another number that you can compare it to and start analyzing deeper. So a bit like that, okay, you've got hospital admissions with COVID. How many of those lead to complications or ICU beds because of COVID? And there you have a more realistic number of the severity of the COVID on somebody who's already admitted to hospital into becoming a life-threatening illness, right?
Absolutely.
And there's stuff like that, and it's just it seems easy when we talk about it now, but at the same time, you would hope that people can see this that it's evident that you can massage things to change it the way you want it almost.
Yeah, 100%. Because then by introducing another number to compare it to, you then make it able to be relative. Right, it can't be relative to itself because it's a single unit. But as soon as you introduce something else, then it's okay, well, this takes on a whole different meaning now. And I think what this is essentially getting at is you can't map every single context, especially contexts that things that haven't happened yet, such as a COVID-19 pandemic, right? And so because you can't map every single procedure, every single action, there will be times where people will act in their own way, right? Their whole biases will seep through, and that's natural. I mean, it happens in everyday life. It's what law tries to stop to a degree, by mapping and creating a law that you can follow. But when there isn't one there, then you can see how they can kind of seep through, and they can influence the person's decision, even on a subconscious level.
Yeah, I another thing I was just thinking of, just off the top of that, was this idea of So you've already got this like complicated hospital-based NHS system that they have procedures for, ways of monitoring, ways of recording data. So, for example, it is probably useful to know how many people come in as a hospital admission in general. So, like, what is the hospitalization rate of the country at any given point?
Yeah.
So what they're doing here in my head, at least, is they've already got this point where they're collecting in hospital admissions. They're just bolting on this idea of, we're going to test them for COVID every time they come to hospital now. And therefore we have hospital admissions with COVID. Yeah. And what's happened here is I feel like they've conflated the two, or they've put forward to the media the hospitalizations with COVID rather than from COVID as the go-to hospitalization number for COVID.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. Because like that's in my head, they probably didn't create many. Obviously, they had to create some changes to the system to account for obviously this virus. But in my head, they've already got a procedure for like documenting data, and they've just basically bolted it on without checking, because it's probably easier to just bolt on, okay, COVID test, okay, they got COVID, boom, tick in the box, than it is to be like, is this person here from COVID or for COVID? With COVID, of which obviously there's some that's a logical stretch. Like if you've broken your leg, obviously it's not. Yeah. But if they don't have a way of processing that, and it's more like, is this person here because they've got like a health problem, which is like, we can't see like diabetes or something that they never had diagnosed before, and also they got COVID or not. So therefore they don't differentiate. They just bucket it in. Yeah. And then ideally you'd have the other stuff, which would be like number of people in ICU beds, to then try and, I guess, balance the two, because it's one of those things that it's a lot easier to talk and critique it than it is to actually do it on the ground, and also change a system that has existed, I don't know, for years now, and teach somebody like a new way of doing it. Like I assume as well, they probably have like a paper base, like the government. Like, have you ever seen like tax return documents where you put it all in specific things, like, scan it just so it gets put onto the database? Okay. They'd have to rechange the whole system for that. So I can imagine it's probably quite difficult, but that's just an alternative. I'm just trying to play like give a bit of sympathy if needed to it, but like why it might have come about, and it seems such a stretch. Yeah, but it's once again it's still not like, if you think about it, it's still not like, you just hope that people on the ground would be a bit like, okay, hang on a second, or we're taking this person as admitted with COVID, but that's it. Once this is the definition, with or from, it's like because
but not even like on from the hospital's point of view, but there are people who literally think about this. This is their job. It is their job to be like, okay, we need to get, what should be their job is to find the truth, right? To be accurate. Like how many people are actually ill, right? Not just have COVID, but have debilitating symptoms from it. And let's try and figure that out. What's the best way to ascertain the most accurate number? And now let's work from a top-down thing and implement, how we're going to measure this. Like there will be people whose job that is, and that's why it is a stretch to try and be like, how did a government and what's even worse, and he talks about this later on, is the changing of the metrics. Right. Yeah. So like halfway through, you're like, oh, wow, maybe that isn't a great way to measure, who's got COVID or who's dying from COVID. And it keeps changing.
They even used the Scottish example before, didn't he? Where he was like, it changed, and then drastically changed the number that was being reported. Yeah.
You'd think with there are so many intelligent people, you could get them all in a room and try and think about this. But
you would think that. Yeah. The last note on this chapter is bias reinforcing itself. So subjective biases and numbers tend to reinforce each other. Strong biases lead to the selection of numbers that confirm them. And when numbers confirm biases, the biases become even stronger. This phenomenon can be observed in the context of the coronavirus crisis. A society gripped by fear and unease chooses numbers that validates its fears, which in turn further intensifies the fear. Yeah. When individuals believe their subjective perspective represents reality, they may consider their reality superior to other perspectives. This mindset can lead to an attempt to impose their fiction on others by any means possible. The discourse surrounding the coronavirus crisis exhibits traits reminiscent of the discourse that gave rise to totalitarian regimes in the 20th century. These traits include the excessive use of numbers and statistics while disregarding facts, the blurring of the boundary between fact and fiction, and an ideological belief that justifies deceit and manipulation, eventually crossing ethical boundaries.
Yeah, it's kind of dipping into the whole evil territory, the book that Roy Baumeister, Evil. I remember him saying that when a group originates around an idea, the person who's the most fanatical about the idea normally becomes the one who's, pushing the group, who becomes the leader of the group. In this case, let's take Hitler as a group, right? And the conflation of their perception, not only with reality, but with the pursuit of good. And I think that's key, because then you see everything for the greater good, everything that you do for the greater good. And it's dangerous
to hero in their story.
Yeah.
Like, you're always the hero in your story, I think. Yeah, it's super interesting as well, especially with the number stuff, like how, like you're saying there, if you like base your perspectives and stuff and reinforce it based upon the numbers, which you may or may not know have been massaged. Like you may be not the guy who's actually doing the data and like thinking about it that much. You just might be the guy who's like, oh my God, look at this. This is crazy. And then obviously based upon that reality, it becomes like, once again, this is when people remember they were like, what's the word? For a lack of a better word, persecuted. When you were like not following the rules of COVID, like not wearing masks. It leads to that, because basically it's like, if the reality is this is super serious, this is how many people are increasing all the time in terms of like infection rates, etc., and you're behaving so belligerently, like you're a bad person, you're not a member of society, and therefore it build up this idea of like sort of like almost like tribalism a little bit. Like these people believe this reality, then there's the counter argument where the people are like, I completely don't agree with it. And then it is the classic like good v evil debate, because the people the people who aren't wearing the masks, they're the good guys, like fighting up against the tyrants, and then the people who are following the rules are going, these guys are not taking care of the rules. They're being like antisocial in a way. They're trying to like, I don't know what they're trying to do, but they're not taking care of others, therefore they're evil. And then you get these two. Well, that's how all conflicts start, really, isn't it?
Absolutely, because your perception changes.
100%.
You start to see everyone else who doesn't agree with you against the greater good, and so then they must be evil, and they must be the enemy, and they must be segregated or marginalized, or super interesting. And just another point, just before moving on, that I wonder how much of this, because like we were saying, not all of this is like malicious and nefarious. Some of it might just come about because of how the system works. And I wonder whether some of that is because of how atomized we are, in the sense that, almost think of like a Ford conveyor, a production line, and you're putting a screw into a little piece of metal, but you have no idea what the metal actually is part of, right? You're doing a tiny bit of the whole, and so you can never actually grasp the whole context of things. And I wonder how much of this is like, I'll do a tiny bit of this data, but I don't know all the data, and then I'll pass it on to him and he'll do a little bit as well. And so you don't know. And I wonder how much of like the communication mechanism between all of these, systems or areas in society, how good they are at communicating determines how mixed the message turns out to be.
I wonder also how much dissent they allow in like the think tanks they create in government, whereas like, how do we inform the policies? We inform it based on data. And I wonder, once again, with politics, because people have agendas and things they want to promote, the moment they have a think tank and one or two of them are like, oh, I don't think we should do this, and here's the reasons why, they're just like, okay, well, we'll, like the next meeting they turn up and it's like, oh, sorry, you've been replaced by this person who is not arguing. Do you get what I mean? I wonder how much of it is that as well. It's like, I've got a good plan. I've got a plan that I want to promote. Like, I don't really want to listen to dissenters. I mean, to be fair, there's also once again with the precautionary principle, there's this idea that if the consequences of not acting and not being severe of your actions ends up being worse, or there is a possibility of it being really bad, sometimes it might be worth just taking the cautionary path and doing stuff, even though it might not be necessary or might be proven to not be necessary. But it's better to take the chance of like saving people's lives now rather than waiting and finding out is actually way worse. Do you get what I mean? Like, because if you think about a lot of the preliminary COVID restrictions and stuff were based on the idea that this could be really quite bad, and therefore the best way to do it is to shut up shop, I guess. And then it's once we know what we're dealing with, we then change the path, but we need to know what we're dealing with first, right? And I kind of agree with that. I think as a move, that's a very good move, right? Like it's like, it could have been something like, I guess what was the really, really bad one? Was it bird flu or Ebola or something? I can't remember those ones where it's like people are actually dying in like mass numbers. And, we've read history like Black Death and stuff, these things can come and wipe out large like percentages of populations. So maybe there's a part of it that's like, we have to take precautions and then develop a strategy based upon the reality. But then as it evolves and we see what's going on, it depends how you're looking at it and what data you're looking at it. And exactly. And this is kind of the point, I guess, of all of this is like, at what point do you realize that it isn't as bad as we thought? And at what point do you reintroduce people to the standard way of living again, etc. Right?
All right, on to the next chapter then, the desire for a master. In the preceding chapters, the transformation of science from open-mindedness to dogma and unwavering certainty was examined. It was revealed how the practical application of science created a sense of isolation between individuals and nature, and how the pursuit of an artificial and controllable universe threatened the very essence of life. Additionally, the belief in the objectivity and measurability of the world led to an arbitrary and subjective outcomes. Chapter 5 delves into the destiny of another significant aspiration of science, the liberation of humankind from anxiety, insecurity, and moral constraints.
Yes, so the next part's called the anxiety makers. So despite the increase in knowledge about the mechanistic aspects of the human body and the substantial expenditure on healthcare, the fear of illness and suffering has remained prevalent. Recent headlines have made it clear. Teenagers riding mopeds to school is deemed irresponsible. Swimming in rivers or ponds during hot weather is discouraged due to bacterial contamination risks. Oral sex is associated with the potential for throat cancer. Shaking hands is considered dangerous for virus transmission. And even sitting next to a non-smoking smoker could be harmful to one's health. Suffering is inherently unpleasant, yet there have been periods in history when people displayed greater resilience towards it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is interesting where you see all this sort of like sensationalist, like headlines. I've seen stuff like, I think you're reading the Nassim Taleb stuff at the moment, aren't you? Like Anti-Fragile, I'm pretty sure. Because he talks about it in his book a little bit where he's like, we end up pontificating over like small micro dosages of like toxins and things, being like, this is going to kill you. And he's just like, it's just, once again, it's always to do with dose and stuff. Like, don't get me wrong, I can understand if you do it all your life, but like smoking every day, all day, whatever, it's going to cause like damage over the long run. But we do tend to sort of like create these things where like everything is bad for you. Like, of course, everything's bad for you in the wrong dosages. Water, you can die from drinking too much water.
But also a little bit of it can be good for you.
Exactly, the whole anti-fragile,
right? You need a bit of harm.
Like there's that argument I think you've probably heard as well, is like, how there's like a movement to stop kids playing in like the dirt and the mud, and people say actually part of the reasons playing in the dirt and mud, it helps them build up their immune system. 100%. And some people are even trying to create like correlatory links between lack of play in dirt and actual like allergies. I can't remember where I saw that, but it was something to do with the lines like, if you mollycoddle them and don't let them get exposed to certain types of bacteria or certain types of substances, they develop, they don't develop a way of dealing with these substances, and therefore it creates allergies. Or that's the explanatory.
Well, you used to get
theory.
like chickenpox parties or mumps parties where essentially like someone with it would have it and you'd go around and get it, because once you have it as a kid, well, first of all, you don't need like a vaccine for childhood disease. Well, for instance, it with chickenpox, right? But like, it is bad if you get it later on in life, and if you haven't got it when you're younger, then
smallpox or whatever it's called.
Exactly. It's much more severe when you're older, and so there literally was like, and I think it's still maybe a little bit of a thing, not as much, but. Trying to protect someone makes them more fragile to an extent. So next part. So the rise of narcissism. While we often attribute human distinctiveness to superior knowledge and awareness compared to animals, a fundamental disparity lies in our constant torment of lacking knowledge. Humans are plagued by unanswered questions regarding their position in the desires of others. What do others think of me? Do they love me? Am I attractive to them? Do I hold significance in their eyes? What are their expectations and desires from me? These inquiries serve as the focal point of human encounters and, by extension, shape the entirety of human existence. In recent decades, alongside the surge in fear and insecurities, narcissism has also witnessed a noticeable rise. It has become commonplace to assert that our society increasingly fixates on external ideals, and there's undeniably some truth to this notion. The demand for surgical procedures aimed at attaining a socially prescribed body image is rapidly escalating. The sale of products such as steroids and protein cocktails used to mold the body into a visual ideal has experienced spectacular growth. Taking selfies has become an established component of both social and antisocial behavior. Homes and gardens are reminiscent of meticulously staged photographs from interior design magazines. Commercials and billboards present stylized representations of cars, haircuts, and clothing. Ultimately, this trend reflects an intensifying obsession with illusory visual solutions in an attempt to resolve the irresolvable uncertainties present in human relationships. Simultaneously, this shift has led to a sharp increase in psychological phenomena associated with an excessive preoccupation with external ideal images. Loneliness, inner emptiness, and constant feelings of being embroiled in exhausting competition with others, referred to as the rat race, have become prevalent experiences.
I mean, it's pretty good social commentary.
Yeah.
Like, he always hits the nail on the head, to be honest, from at least. I mean, if you take a step back, I feel like he's just commenting on the current trends that you see prevalent on social media. Let's just say maybe this isn't the case for people who've are off social media, but this kind of seems to be like the social media rat race. The how good can you look in regards to your body, your like house, your life, your haircut, etc. It is very visually orientated, isn't it? It's almost like, it's funny, isn't it? It's like it's become more about the optics, the appearance, rather than the actual realities underneath it. And there was this great book I was telling you to read a couple of months ago. Like, I think it was How to Live, and it was How Adam Smith's Good for Telling You How to Live, or something like that, by Russ Roberts. Yeah. And he talks a lot about this idea of, to live a fulfilling life, you have to like learn how to be loved. I think it was, or something like this, or we want to be loved. And his definition as well. Yeah, exactly that. It was something like, the problem with the sort of day-to-day life we live now is we are trying to like show to people that we should be loved without working on ourselves first and realizing we deserve to be loved in the first place. Like, you have to convince yourself first that you are somebody who deserves to be loved. Yeah. And I feel like there's like something inherent with this idea of like showing off the visuals. It's like you are showing off stuff that makes you feel like that's what's going to get you the chance to be loved, when in reality it's more like your character below it rather than the visuals. So therefore you almost have this like imbalance where like you're showing all this off and you're getting recognition for people like, oh wow, your life looks amazing or whatever, blah blah blah, but this is like deep down uncertainty with yourself because you've not learned how to like develop a character that you're proud of and you're happy with. So you have this imbalance of like, oh, I could be this thing that I project to everybody, but I'm not, and it makes you even sadder. And in fact, I butchered it because it's not how to be loved. There's something else, but I'll try and return to this point at some point.
It's a good point. I wonder whether there's an element of, one, maybe it's harder to work on yourself rather than like the exterior image, and so we are hesitant to do that. But I wonder also if to confront the inner self and work on that, there can be fear that when you do it, you're not going to be this person that you want to be, or that you won't like who you are. And I wonder whether that's another reason why, as a coping mechanism, we kind of deal with the exterior, because we can.
Well, it's the easiest to fake in my head. It's the easiest thing to like, because obviously if you, from what you just said there, it's like there's external things you can do to increase that like visual stuff. Like you could earn more money to buy these things. You know what I mean? Like it's attainable. It's like it is hard work, obviously, to attain these things, but like it's easier work in my head than changing your inner self, if that makes sense.
No, I agree.
So I've actually found a note here. I'm gonna go with it because I got it wrong. So it's called Being Lovely, and it's like he wants to differentiate.
I remember you saying this.
So when Smith says we want to be lovely, he means worthy of being loved. Sorry. When we earn the admiration of others, honestly, by being respectful, honourable, blameless, generous, and kind, the end result is true happiness. Smith's ideal is achieved when your inner self mirrors your outer self. And that's what I thought was super interesting. So like, if I get praise that I don't deserve, says Smith, it shouldn't bother me. The praise feels good, but knowing it is undeserved makes it impossible to enjoy. So this is why I think you get some people who actually behave in ways that are like fraudulent, who make like, you know, millions or whatever, behave in a way that's like, they know deep down they shouldn't have. They're always going to be chasing that like pleasurable experience because they're not content with how they achieve the things they achieve. So when people are like, wow, like you're amazing, but he knows he's like employed slave labor somewhere or whatever, like, and he's just there, like, he's just like, oh fuck, like at what cost, you know? So
that's a good point. I like that.
So yes, on to learning rules. So alongside narcissism, there exists a second social phenomenon intimately tied to the escalation of fear and insecurity, the remarkable proliferation of rules, often referred to as regulators. So as soon as words acquire meaning, the relationship with others ascends to a higher level. A child becomes fixated on comprehending the words used by others to express their desires. What does it truly mean to be good? What actions must be undertaken to be deemed brave? In essence, the child seeks to grasp the rules that must be adhered to in order to be loved. At times, this longing for rules takes the form of a relentless demand for clarity. Even when a rule is well defined, it is deemed insufficiently explicit and necessitates further elaboration. Since words derive meaning through the use of other words, the child begins to question the significance of every possible word. I feel like this is the why phase, you know, whenever it's like, why that, why? In fact, this is it. Around the age of 3.5, this obsession with the meaning of words reaches its apex in the renowned why phase. During this phase, the child incessantly poses questions beginning with why. Why is this a donkey? Because it is braying. Why is it braying? Because it is angry. Why is it angry? And so on. In this stage, the child perceives the parent as an all-knowing authority, and despite occasionally displaying fierce resistance, the child demands that the parent assume this omniscient position. The child yearns to possess comprehensive knowledge. Yet the child's endeavor to render the rules unambiguous and definitive is destined to fail, for human language can never obtain absolute meaning. The more persistently the child interrogates the parents in an attempt to establish unequivocal rules, the more the child inevitably becomes entangled in intricate and contradictory interpretations. This process is particularly evident in children with a compulsive disposition, leading them to experience severe inhibition, entwined in an unending pursuit of mental perfection that becomes increasingly burdensome. As we shall discover later, children eventually free themselves from the relentless demand for rules by accepting that a definitive answer regarding desire does not exist. So the task of adhering to the ever-expanding set of rules proves insurmountable, causing the competent authorities themselves to sink into a state of bewildering confusion. Sorry, and this bit, I took the notes for this bit because it was more about like the developmental reasons for like how children sort of develop like abiding by rules.
Yeah. No, but I think it's good to know. I think it kind of just gives a bit of like context to how we perceive the world and how it could go one of two ways. Either you kind of accept and acknowledge that not everything can be kind of mapped, you know, everything can't have a rule.
Everything can't have a why. Once you dig down far enough, it's turtles all the way down. It's
exactly. You just reach that rock bottom. And you kind of can, and Isn't it funny though, on the 5 whys front, how obviously the mechanistic science ideology has changed it? So for example, in the past, you go, why, he's angry, why? Because God gave us this, why, whatever. You get down to like a sort of mythical religious reasoning. And now it's kind of like you could do why so many times. Why is he angry? Because there's like a different biochemical reaction in his brain. Why is there a biochemical reaction? Because of evolution. Why is evolution? Because of the particles sort of became self-organizing, whatever, reinforcing, whatever. Eventually the why is the Big Bang, but like the difference is quite interesting. Do you kind of know what I mean? Because the Big Bang affords no reason. It affords like, once you get back down to the Big Bang or whatever, it's like, okay, well, what's the point of anything? Whereas why with God? Like because God designed it this way for this purpose. But at least then there's a reason, trajectory. Okay, I get you.
You know what I mean? There's like a difference between the two. And this is kind of what I saw as one of like the big points of this idea of the mechanistic and the religious ideology, and why, because obviously we both, I like to think we both were atheists, and I still am. But it's like now from like thinking about this and obviously reading some of the Peterson and stuff, I kind of actually now realize the importance of religion in that sense.
100%.
Because like we've said before in the first podcast and many times before, science doesn't afford to you ways to behave. Because technically you could justify anything. Oh, I'm angry. Okay, why am I angry? Because there's an evolutionary reason to be angry, because somebody slighted me. Okay, what does that mean? I need to best them in competition because that's what animals do, or like beat the crap out of them. Do you get what I mean? There's then there becomes a reasoning for like bullying and reasoning for like domination through aggression. If that makes sense, you can rationalize anything if you take that mechanistic approach, because it's like, well, I'm angry, so I'm angry, therefore I can just justify it because, there's nothing matters. Like,
yes, no, I get that. Precisely. And it's almost like this why mechanism allows you to go to the boundaries of what science can explain, and then would probably, or used to at least, kind of provide you a new direction to explore the rest of the map, whereas if you don't hold on to that kind of ideology and you instead are very nihilistic, then you just think that that's where it stops. There is no there's nothing beyond the boundary to find, and that it's just like everything can, you can operate within your boundaries and never have to grow or expand. Interesting. So then on to the next point, regulation mania. The obsession with regulations, with all its excessive and irrational tendencies, undoubtedly contributes to the psychological challenge of our time. The contradictory and ambiguous nature of numerous rules creates a neurotic Pavlovian effect, stifling the satisfaction, spontaneity, and joy of life. Autonomy and freedom are increasingly diminished as the space for them shrinks. The suffocating impact of an excess of rules becomes most apparent when it suddenly disappears. For example, when one arrives in a small French village with an unpainted white lines on the streets, there are no strict guidelines dictating where to drive or park. Parking is allowed along the road without payment and time limitations. Similarly, at a rural train station, parking meters may be absent. Toilets are freely accessible and platforms remain open at all times. It is akin to the relief felt when the incessant hum of an office air conditioner ceases at 6 o'clock, offering a moment of blissful tranquility. And it's funny just because I can relate so much. I remember when I went to Portugal recently and like I didn't have to pay for parking. Or at least
you were saying
so.
this,
And I was just like, what is this place? Like, there's at first
like
there's kind of there's kind of like an element of like anxiety. You're like, oh shit, have I got this wrong? Am I going to get a ticket? Blah, blah. And then afterwards you're like, oh God, this is actually so nice. Like an
alternative way of living exists. It's like, oh my God. It's why they say you're traveling, isn't it? Explore other cultures, just so you can see that, like, the way everybody does it in your country isn't exactly the only way to organize things.
100%. Regulation mania, as exemplified by governmental bureaucracy, seeks to rationalize and standardize social interactions by fitting them into predefined templates. In this regard, the ideal bureaucratic resembles a computer, faithfully adhering to the logic of their system without being distracted by the individuality of the people they are supposed to assist. Consequently, a bureaucratic system evokes the same frustration as dealing with a computer. We encounter a mechanical other that remains indifferent to our unique human qualities. A computer is not inherently unfair or unjust. It is just an other that imposes an unwavering logic. Whether we have a meeting in 5 minutes and urgently need to print a report, the computer remains unyielding and unaccommodating. Computer says no. In this aspect, a computer resembles an idealized totalitarian leader, strictly and ruthlessly enforcing its own logic upon the population.
Yeah, I mean, that in itself is quite interesting because like you or we've always spoke about before, like the importance of like context in certain things, and because you can never capture all the possible situations. Having a ruthless enforcing logic really does sort of inhibit like a society where like there must be reasons for like I was gonna say like pardoning, but like for example, you create a rule, you don't realize what it's stifling, and then you should actually have opportunities for the rule to be overturned or in certain aspects. I mean, that's why the law works quite well. It's like the rule is this, but the judge has decided this, therefore the law gets updated, right? Like it's quite interesting in specific cases, and it should evolve like that, right? It should I think it does, at least to some respects. It should, or does, sorry.
Well, they're referenced, aren't they? Like different cases, so that it kind of adds the context of things.
Yeah, exactly. Adds the context, because once again, like context and stuff changes over time, right? Like it's
100%.
Applying the same rules to the past to now it's weird whether the situation and the population, the problems are all different to the past, right?
100%. And otherwise, you end up assimilating or attempting to assimilate reality into this kind of predetermined kind of structure that you've set. Whereas it's just inevitably going to fail because it doesn't fit within the box.
Yeah. Cool. So the next part is, how did the Enlightenment tradition, which aimed for greater freedom and opposed fear and insecurity, paradoxically lead to hyper-strict morality? So the answer becomes clear through the lens of developmental psychology presented above, which was around the children's learning to words, etc. So the Enlightenment tradition, driven by the ideology of reason, sought to rationalize and systemize life, relegating symbolism, mysticism, fiction, and poetry to secondary roles. However, it is precisely these forms of discourse that enable us to respond to life's uncertainties with creativity and individuality, and to find meaningful connections with others. Of particular significance is the second attempt to resolve fear. The more we endeavor to eliminate fear and uncertainty through rationality and rigid rules, the more we encounter failure. As we discuss in this chapter, language itself reveals there is no ultimate word or definitive resolution to dispel uncertainty. It is at this juncture that humanity turns toward an unexpected path in its pursuit of freedom. The allure of the absolute master, the totalitarian leader who claims to possess the final word. The rationalistic approach to life, which sought to address fear and uncertainty, ironically led to an inability to effectively manage these challenges. The rise of narcissism and regulation mania only exacerbated that very issues they aimed to solve, resulting in a psychologically drained society that yearns for an absolute authority. Surprisingly, this quest for a master figure aligns with the prevailing worldview that emerged from the mechanistic ideology, the very ideology responsible for the initial problem. It is this ideology that entices minds with its immense control over matter and seemingly irrefutable evidence supported by numbers and statistics. So I thought that was quite interesting, because one of the things I thought about when I was reading this was, so the point being, or at least the thing that I was thinking about when I was reading this, was this idea that obviously as humans, we know that we sort of like hate this uncertainty. And obviously this mechanistic ideology has kind of brought about this, or this Enlightenment approach to the world in terms of embracing our ignorance, you know, realizing we don't know everything, that we can't control anything, obviously doesn't provide that sort of certainty that humanity kind of needs, which religion once provided through like God, etc. This is the way the world is, whatever. Yeah. What it really needs with that in my head was that sort of almost like Stoic philosophy based worldview underneath it, where it's kind of like, it's I guess a worldview that helps you deal with the uncertainties that is life and become almost accepting of the reality that is, that, you know, you can't control these things, but you can control what you can control. Yeah. But we've like, and that's why in my head, at least, there's this massive movement in this, like, since like Tim Ferriss has popularized it, and obviously Ryan Holiday, but like this almost like Stoic movement. And you almost find in my head the people who are the most chilled and calm in life tend to have this very like Stoic resolve. And that's obviously this like a relationship towards, I guess, adversity, uncertainty, fear. Fear. That's very much more like, I accept that it exists. Yeah. I'm going to control what I can control, and I'm just going to, you know, like the memento mori kind of thing. I'm going to die one day, so I need to make the most of my life, etc. Whatever. And what was the point being here is that without some sort of philosophical grounding like that, like a sort of operating system, that's what Tim Ferriss I think calls it. This idea that everything's uncertain is very daunting to people, especially because you're not taught this sort of like mindset of like, you know, this is how you should, like, maybe it's not like the best way of thinking about everything, but it's like a very good way of dealing with the stress and uncertainty of reality, right? Yeah. And it's something that's not really taught or even put on a pedestal as like a underlying story, worldview, belief of humanity that could, you know, build up resilient human beings. We're not built like that anymore. We're turning towards all this other stuff to find certainty, you know. Like I said, instead of embracing the uncertainty of I don't know if this person likes me, whatever, it's more like, oh, I need to try and grab that certainty through buying visual related stuff to make me look great and therefore be admired and adored, rather than working on the other stuff that we were saying before, like how to be lovely and stuff, where you're developing the character through behavior. And embracing the uncertainty. But that's the only thing I had off the side of that, because I just thought
no, absolutely
like a cure to it.
It's interesting because I wonder whether, I mean, it's almost like an evolutionary mechanism, isn't it, for change, to explore development by having this paradoxical internal struggle with wanting to be safe and secure and have comfort, and then also having like needing to overcome adversity to grow and explore potential. And as a result, it almost seems like different philosophies have started up to try and hone that ability to, instead of fearing and turning away from adversity and difficult times, and actually like approach it and acknowledge it and accept it and move with it, integrate it. And the Stoicism, like you said, is basically one of those. It's like an operating system. And it's interesting because time and time again throughout civilization, we've seen, how society shifts towards a more comfortable, secure, but then it becomes, a totalitarian regime. And then as a response to that, then that regime gets overthrown. And then you're back in this kind of period where, and it's just very cyclical, because it's this kind of like paradoxical cycle that we go through. And in that space of time, we discover new things, but there's a lot of suffering that goes along that journey. And that's why I think it's important to kind of have a recognition of these different philosophies that kind of embody approaching it and integrating it, and not being so focused on the external,
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. All right. Well, moving on to part 2, mass formation and totalitarianism. I mean, pretty much the core essence of this book to an extent. So mass formation is largely the result of individuals being gripped by a common narrative that unites them in a heroic battle against an object of anxiety. So chapter 6, the rise of the masses. The totalitarian state distinguishes itself significantly from other forms of dictatorial governments, not only in its internal structure, but also in its progressive nature. Hannah Arendt, in her book The Origins of Totalitarianism, attributes this distinction to a psychological level. While dictatorships primarily rely on instilling fear through physical aggression, leading the population to submit under duress, the totalitarian state emerges through the social, psychological process of mass formation. Interesting distinction there. Understanding this process is crucial in comprehending the astonishing psychological characteristics observed within a totalitarian society. The individual's willingness to sacrifice personal interest for the collective, the extreme intolerance of dissenting voices, the pervasive informant mentality enabling the government to infiltrate private lives, the alarming susceptibility to absurd pseudo-scientific indoctrination and propaganda, the blind adherence to narrow logic that surpasses ethical boundaries, rendering totalitarianism incompatible with religion, the suppression of diversity and creativity, making totalitarianism an enemy of art and culture, and its inherent self-destructiveness, leading to the eventual demise of the totalitarian systems. It's kind of what we were just touching on.
Yeah.
Gustave Le Bon, a French sociologist and psychologist known for his influential work on mass formation, argued that in the masses, the individual's soul is entirely overshadowed by the group soul. This uniformity is accompanied by a near complete loss of rational thinking and critical reflection, even among individuals who, under normal circumstances, exhibit intelligence and the capacity for sound judgment. Moreover, it is marked by a strong inclination to succumb to impulses that, in normal circumstances, would be considered fundamentally unethical.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I don't have too much to add on that.
It's such an interesting point, isn't it? Just, yeah.
To be honest, it's gonna. One of the things I was looking at is the name Gustave Le Bon. It made me chuckle a little bit because it's like Le Bon for me means the good. It's like Gustave the good.
The good. Did he name that self-proclaimed? Yeah, I'm assuming
self-proclaimed. Yeah. That's it.
Yeah. That's funny.
It is funny,
but it is. It's just interesting to see that this kind of manifests on a psychological level.
Of course,
and obviously Le Bon calls it individual soul, but essentially it's like identity, isn't it? Like individual identity, personal identity versus the collective, or group identity.
It reminds me. Was it Peter who was saying this? Like, Peterson, or maybe he was quoting somebody else, like, do people have ideas or do ideas have people?
Yeah,
Can you remember that?
it's the latter.
It reminds me of that. Yeah,
ideas that people don't have ideas yet. Ideas have people.
Yeah, because it's essentially one way of looking at the sort of totalitarianism, like in general, is like an idea has literally just taken over society.
Yeah,
like an idealistic state of society is taking over everybody. This ideal allows them to like justify any sort of action to hit and attain this ideal.
Absolutely. And I was talking about it last night, funnily enough, and it's interesting because it's almost like this idea, because I'm fascinated by that, like that little phrase, because I think it's so true, but I just can't quite grasp what it's really trying to convey. But it's almost like ideas are like amoebas, you know, they're like, they can come in and they can like wrap themselves around your belief system. And then you see everything through this new lens and that's why it can go so deep and become so part of your core and your character, because it is able to seep into very deep. It's like a very flexible idea that can lend itself to, like, you know, your core beliefs, and then it's very hard to disentangle.
And it's like the circuits that fire together, wire together, whatever it is, the neurons that fire together, wired together. So like, I guess the more you could say is like having a scale electrics in your brain, and if you just keep using it again and again, you're just making these deep grooves, and then all of a sudden nothing else can be sort of thought about, kind of thing.
Exactly.
And
I wonder whether there's people who are most susceptible to this are people who, there must be like some kind of ratio. That's probably too simplistic, but in terms of like your personal and collective identity, and how much you rely on having a group identity, or, you know, or maybe how self-conscious you are. And so you turn to like a group to like fill in that gap. And whether you're more susceptible, if you're more susceptible to that, then you might be more susceptible to ideas taking over your whole kind of way you see the world. Don't know. Interesting there.
It is. So the next part is the 4 conditions for large-scale mass formation. So 4 conditions are crucial for the emergence of large-scale mass formation in a society. Conditions that were present during the rise of Nazism and Stalinism and continue to exist today. The first condition is the prevailing sense of generalized loneliness, social isolation, and the absence of meaningful social bonds among the population. Arendt emphasized the significance of this condition, stating that the defining characteristic of the mass man is not brutality, but rather a profound sense of isolation and lack of normal social relationships. This erosion of social connectedness leads to the second condition, a pervasive lack of meaning in life. This condition largely stems from the first one. As inherently social beings, humans find purpose in their relationship with others. Furthermore, the mechanistic worldview also contributes to the sense of meaningless in a more direct manner. Both the universe and the individual trapped within it are seen as mechanical entities devoid of purpose or intention. Interactions among material particles adhere to mechanical laws, but lack any inherent meaning. Viewing life through this lens, regardless of its validity, renders existence devoid of significance. So the third condition is the widespread presence of free-floating anxiety and psychological unease within the population. Free-floating anxiety refers to anxiety that is not tied to specific images or objects, unlike fears of thunder, snakes, or war. This form of anxiety is mentally challenging to manage and carries the constant risk of escalating into panic, which is one of the most distressing psychological states experienced by individuals. This condition has been particularly pronounced in the early decades of the 21st century. For instance, the WHO, the World Health Organization, reports that 1 in 5 people worldwide has been diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. These numbers are significant, and it is likely that they underestimate the true extent of the issue. And lastly, we have the fourth condition, which in turn arises from the preceding 3. A pervasive presence of free-floating frustration and aggression. The connection between the social isolation and irritability is both logical and empirically supported. Individuals affected by loneliness, a lack of meaning, and indeterminate anxiety often experience heightened irritability, frustration, and aggression, seeking outlets for these emotions. The stark increase in a racist and threatening language on social media in recent years, tripling between 2015 and 2020, serves as a striking example. What fuels mass formation is not merely the frustration and aggression that find expression, but the latent potential for unexpressed aggression within the population, seeking an object on which to discharge. this also kind of links to, but not directly, it's like the René Girard's ideas of like mimetic desire, scapegoating. You know how everybody like looks what others want, and then basically it climaxes this point where they find a scapegoat to place all their aggression onto. It is, in that sense, it is the same. It's like we get all this like built up anxiety and aggression, and then we need something to direct it at. And it's usually like an object or like a symbol, right? And once again, you can say stuff like, for example, Hitler was decided it was the Jews, right? Like it's and it's this type of thing where that, like, what was Stalinism again? Was it the Bolsheviks or was it the bourgeois? Bolsheviks, was it? I can't remember. Anyway, they picked like a population basically and said, these are the targets. This is the enemy. This is where this is why you feel this free floating anxiety, is because this is something's being stolen from you. They're stopping us from hitting the destiny of the desired land. It's like,
but it's so interesting how it can be in retaliation to, like he says, a widespread presence of free floating anxiety, even if we don't know where that anxiety is coming from. And it presents that opportunity to like, okay, well, if no one actually knows why they're anxious, then we can provide a reason for why they're anxious and therefore the solution, right? And I think, I mean, I don't know about you, but like I see this in society on a very large level. You know, the sense of loneliness, the lack of meaning, the jobs that people do and try to convince themselves that, you know, that it's adding meaning to their life, and the fear of going out and doing something that generally they like or they're passionate about. And then this like everyone, I mean, we're in this crisis at the moment where everyone has anxiety. I mean, it's like this new social movement almost to an extent where like everyone has anxiety, and like, you know, there are people who genetically have predispositions to anxiety. Okay. It's a tiny, tiny percentage. Most people, the rest of the reasons why they have anxiety are due to their environmental situations, their circumstances, things that they have power over to an extent, right? I'm not saying that they shouldn't seek help or anything like that. Absolutely not. But the fact is it can change. But it's identifying where that anxiety lies, and not just accepting that someone, you know, presents a reason for that anxiety. Is like, oh yeah, okay.
Yeah, I get what you're getting at. Yeah, it's like everybody has their own sources of their own anxiety, which they almost might need to explore, right? It's one of those funny things, isn't it, at this day and age, where like quite a lot of it's just like there's an alternative explanation as well, which is like the biochemical one, where it's like, okay, right, because the reasoning is you have a biochemical imbalance, let's just say, and that's why you got anxiety, therefore you need medication, right? So that's one of the ways of doing it. Then there's obviously the therapist approach, which is like, you got this free flowing anxiety because of this and this, and they usually listen to you, find out your situation, whatever, create other narratives for you to try and believe in, etc. But like, the point being here is there's different ways to deal with the same problem. And then there's also the other way, which is what we're saying here, where technically like leaders and people who have followings can redirect the anxiety as well. I feel like this is the reason why people don't like, or people in politics don't particularly like, the influence maybe influencers have, such as Peterson, or even on the alternative side, like the left side, etc. Because they can create realities for people by basically saying, you know how you're feeling? Well, it's because of this. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's almost like we all have our own ways of dealing with it. But heck, even the way we're saying it right here is a way of being like, okay, we see all this free floating anxiety. What is the reasoning for it? And this is the narrative we're reading from this book, which is making sense of it. But like, there's multiple ways you can
there is, but it's once again like, you know, the biochemistry or the environmental, I mean,
they're interlinked, by the way, as well.
They're interlinked. That's my point. As in like, it's not like your environment doesn't affect your biochemistry.
Of course,
and like vice versa, right? It is a cycle to an extent, but I think on every level,
so you're not malnourishment, like diet.
Absolutely,
health,
I mean,
like all of this is like linked, right? You know,
there's so many things, but the fact is, the thing that is common amongst all of it is that everyone is an individual, right? Your problems are going to be slightly different to someone else's. They might have the same solution, yes, but like, it's not necessarily going to be exactly the same, and so it requires kind of individual personal reflection to be able to figure out what your issues are. But it's just, you know, when there's when there's a totalitarian regime, it's almost like buying people. It's like, well, I'll buy your comfort. I'll sell you comfort if you buy and I'll get your loyalty to an extent, right?
I'll tell you what you want to hear, which is basically give you some form of certainty, blame everything on a certain amount, and then by logical or a certain object or whatever, and by logical conclusion, then the extermination of the object is a necessity to get the balance back almost.
Yeah. And realistically, during the COVID crisis, the population that was chose were essentially the people who didn't want to get vaccinated with a COVID vaccine. They were the ones who marginalized or, told that they were causing all the issues. And that's, it then gave that kind of they were the scapegoat, right? That people could then blame all of their unsubdued kind of anxiety onto, I think, to an extent. All right. So next part, how does mass formation work? The conditions mentioned earlier create a fertile ground for mass formation, which is triggered by a suggestive narrative in the public sphere. When the circumstances described above are present and a compelling story is disseminated through mass media, indicating a target of anxiety, example, the aristocracy of Stalinism, Jews and Nazism, or anti-vaxxers during the coronavirus crisis, along with proposed strategy to address that anxiety, there's a real possibility that the prevailing anxiety will converge onto that specific target. Consequently, there is broad social support for implementing the suggested strategy to control the identified source of anxiety. And I think just the key point there is that it has to be something that they can follow, right? A strategy to address that anxiety there is because it's something that can actually be done. Right. And I guess that's what makes it more convincing than others, rather than it's just some kind of abstract narrative.
Yeah. Here's the plan.
Exactly. Because you can have an end sight. You've got a goal and then in sight, which is convincing. So this process yields psychological benefits. Firstly, the previously diffuse and nebulous anxiety that permeated society becomes associated with a distinct cause and can be mentally managed through the proposed strategy outlined in the narrative. Secondly, the struggle against the enemy allows the fragmented society to regain a sense of unity, purpose, and basic meaning. Consequently, the fight against the object of anxiety becomes a mission imbued with pathos and collective heroism. For example, the Belgian government's team of 11 million rallying against the coronavirus. Thirdly, during this fight, any pent-up frustration and aggression find an outlet, particularly towards those who reject the narrative and resist the mass formation. This release and gratification provide immense satisfaction to the masses, which they are reluctant to relinquish easily.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much what you were just saying before you read that bit about this idea of the strategy almost is that, right?
Yeah.
It's claim the enemy, create a sense of shared identity.
It's a grand flu.
Yeah, it is a grand flu. It actually is. So yeah,
you're giving them another kind of group identity, and you're saying that this group identity will ease you of your anxiety, right?
I mean, yeah, technically anti-vax is a granfalloon as well, but it's a granfalloon of the enemy. I mean, to be fair, you can use granfalloons in both ways, can't you? You can use it for yourself and you can use it to delineate the enemy. So for those listening, a granfalloon is when you create a label. I think, first of all, it was covered in the Age of Propaganda, I think it was, wasn't it? And it wasn't influence. I'm pretty sure it was the Age of Propaganda. But a granfalloon is a technique used by persuaders to create a sense of shared identity. So me and Tristan for ages have been joking about being the blue shirt boys because we both were wearing blue shirts on the day. But it creates this idea of a shared identity that only we get because it's an inside joke kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing. We could actually do it for our enemies as well. You could just be like, look at those guys there eating the chicken nuggets from McDonald's, the Nuggy Boys. It's that something stupid like that. You've done the same thing there. You've created a label, a shared identity between the two of you or whoever you're experiencing that a moment with, that you can remember for a long time. And it's the same here with what they're saying here. It's creating an enemy as well, the anti-vaxxers. It is a granfalloon. It's piling people into that group of the enemy.
Absolutely.
Right, we're moving on to the next part. So solidarity and ritual. In most significant mass formations, the primary appeal for individuals to join is the sense of solidarity within the collective. Those who choose not to participate are often criticized for their perceived lack of solidarity and civic responsibility. Consequently, the absurd aspects of a narrative hold little significance for the masses, as their belief in the story stems not from its factual accuracy, but from its ability to forge new social bonds. The strategy proposed to address the object of anxiety effectively fulfills the role of a ritual. Ritualistic behaviors serve the purpose of fostering group cohesion. They are symbolic actions that seek to align the individual with the collective, emphasizing their subordination to the group's interests and objectives. I mean, I was going to just jump in with sort of clapping for the NHS type stuff there, and that's one of the examples I think you might have given in the book. But like collective shared ritual, certain time of the day, all clap, all share this idea that we're like aiding the help, etc. We're aiding the team, aiding the shared identity. Makes sense for the reason for rituals existing in that sense.
It's so just like
mate, there's so many of these that exist in life, like ritual going to the gym, for example. People who go to the gym see it in each other. Like it's like a ritual where people who go to the gym, we do this symbolic ritual of just going. Like if you think about it, it's absurd. I just stand there, like pick up some weight and just move it up and down.
Well, yes and no though, because like, you know, that ritual you are getting a benefit from, whereas there can be rituals that like it's not like clapping but would save people's lives.
Of course. So it can be. The point being though, like we do have these many rituals throughout our life, which actually allow it's just shared action essentially. A ritual, like shared action. Like I would even argue something on the lines of, let's just say you have a group of people you play football with regularly, like I did on Sundays. That's a shared ritual. Yeah. Like it is a form of like social bonding and shared like collective. So like that's how teams are created, I guess, just shared playing again and again and again. But anyway, it's besides the point. It's probably it's like a very like explaining something that's so obvious. Like, that doesn't necessarily need explaining, you know, it's one of those things.
I guess the core essence of like a ritual is something that consolidates the belief with which that ritual surrounds, you know? So I guess it doesn't matter what it is. It's the same thing with like people put on their lucky socks when they go and play football. You know, because they scored a goal in it last time. I mean, like technically there isn't a logical link, but for them it like embolsters that kind of belief in that outcome, you know?
The point here being maybe then is what this new system has to do is create a brand new ritual which symbolizes the new way of thinking. Let's just put it that way. Like ignore what we just said about the other rituals, because you're right, it makes sense. It's like you create a shared new behavior that you then create this new identity around.
And also because it's actionable, if someone doesn't do it, then they show that they are not part of that. Right?
Yeah, no, that's it.
And it goes to the point where like they conflate the things that if you didn't do this, then you don't care about that. Right?
Bro, it's like the virtue signaling, isn't it?
Yeah, it's
It's like, oh, you didn't virtue signal this time. You must hate, like, I don't know. You must hate black people because you didn't do the Black Lives Matter.
You didn't plug.
You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
It's that type of thing. It's but it is like that. It's become like that. It's almost like. But I remember there was another book. I don't think it's this one where it talks about the absurdities where everybody tries to outdo each other with their like ritualities. So like they're like. So these people stand up for these people, but these people take to the next level where they go do something else. Like, look at me, I'm so righteous. I'm doing this now. I thought that's quite funny.
Well, it's almost the road to making society binary, isn't it? Splitting society, because you can't be like in the middle. You're either in or you're out. Interesting. All right, then. So on to the next part. So the media and mass formation. Ultimately, the participation of individuals in mass formation is rarely driven by rational considerations. The endorsement of a strategy by experts with prestigious titles, often showcased on national television, creates an illusion of widespread acceptance. Many people find this sufficient evidence of the measure's validity, reasoning that the experts must know what they're doing, or they wouldn't say it if it wasn't true. In essence, the appeal to popularity and authority, known as logical fallacies since ancient times, is enough to sway most individuals to accept the narratives. It becomes apparent that the motivation to conform to the story lies more in the formation of a group and associated social pressure than in the accuracy of the story itself. Drawing a parallel with hypnosis, both hypnosis and mass formation involve the use of suggestive statements or stories delivered through a persuasive voice, which narrow the focus of attention to a limited aspect of reality. In this psychological process of mass formation, it appears that mass media almost instinctively perpetuates the formation by selectively presenting graphics and information that support the narrative, further reinforcing the established story.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, we talked a lot about this kind of with the propaganda aspect, didn't we? Essentially, it just makes you focus on one particular aspect of the whole.
Yeah. So the last part of this chapter is called radical intolerance. So an additional crucial characteristic of mass formation is the emergence of radical intolerance towards dissenting opinions and a strong inclination towards authoritarianism. From the perspective of the masses, those who express opposing views are perceived as one, antisocial and lacking solidarity because they refuse to partake in the collective solidarity fostered by the mass formation. 2, unsupported, as critical arguments are disregarded within the limited sphere of attention of the masses. 3, highly aversive because they pose a threat to the intoxication and force the masses to confront the negative circumstances that preceded the mass formation, such as the lack of social bonds, meaning, and the presence of indefinite fear and unease. 4, exceedingly frustrating because they jeopardize the outlet, the latent aggression. So this radical intolerance ingrains a conviction among the masses that they possess superior ethical and moral intentions, while perceiving everything and everyone who resists them as reprehensible. Those who do not participate are branded as traitors to the collective. Consequently, informants become commonplace, with the population itself functioning as a key informant network, resembling a secret police force. And I thought that was interesting because I remember the amount of people who did like COVID parties and then had their names calling in on them.
It's so interesting, isn't it? It's just, and it's what we were talking about earlier on. You know, it conflates it with the pursuit of good, and then anyone who doesn't hold the same ideals, well, they must be against the greater good. And it justifies all your actions, informing on them. And I mean, it went so far to like the extent where, you know, I heard stories where like mothers were informing on their like sons for breaking the curfew or breaking like really stupid fucking rules. But the extent that someone is willing to like, you know, I mean, you know, whether the rules are right or wrong, the fact that like a family member was willing to do that, it just shows you the extent in the belief of this kind of social shared identity that people are willing to engage in.
So before we finish it, because I think we'll finish it here and we'll do part 3. I was just thinking of a kind of like counter argument to all of this against this totalitarianistic, authoritarianistic sort of like movement. The only counter argument I could think of in my head right now, and it kind of does make sense if you think about it, is the situation, although it resembles the authoritarianistic, totalitarianistic state in the sense of the measures that have been used, it was done for a reason that's slightly different than the others, which is that it was because of a health crisis, if that makes sense. So like people snitching on other people it's so logically connected to saving lives. It's easier to believe it and to want to enforce it than you know, people snitching on people because they were like they were capitalists or some shit in these Stalinistic. Do you get what I'm saying? It's slightly different.
I get
like,
you. Yeah,
and I'm not saying anything against the rest of the book. I do believe because of the way the society is heading, we are heading into the situation where these things are sort of these like top-down regulations, etc., and interventions are becoming more widespread. I just think it's worth distinguishing between there's the similarities, yes, because there's similarities because that's the playbook. The playbook to get mass action is this, in my head. It's create an enemy, create a shared identity, point the aggression at this enemy, etc. Right? For me, that's how you get mass societal movement. For example, like propaganda in the wars, right? Same sort of premise. Like, this is the enemy. They're like, I can remember these doing some weird shit. Was there like propaganda saying like all the Germans were like all fucking their cousins or some shit or some like? Do you go? They were doing some stuff where like it was like barbarous. Like the stuff they're doing is like barbaric. It was horrible. Putting these guys at like a step level. These guys need to be exterminated. You know, type of thing. But what I'm saying here is the playbook's the same for mass change or mass control, I guess you could say. But the reasoning behind it is slightly different. But the point being here, I think, is more at what point does this intervention stop, and and who's actually deciding these things, etc. I think.
No, I think it's a very good point. I think it's less about the topic and more about what society values. I mean, if you were to go back 100 years ago to Germany, What they valued was the fact that, you know, their country had been torn apart. It had hyperinflation. There was a huge issue. It probably impacted everyone on economic level, right?
Yeah, the situation.
It's the situation that can allow for these things to be implemented. Because if it was about something that people didn't really care about, like, oh, this person's a gamer, you know, and this person doesn't game, like, no one's going to get behind it. That's why this is such a kind of convincing. I think it has to be incredibly convincing because, for instance, who's going to argue with, do you want to save lives, right? No one's going to argue with that. It's the same thing that we're seeing now. It's like, who's going to argue with not wanting to save the planet? But in response, we can put in any rules we want because no one's going to argue with that because it's almost such a simple argument that to argue against it, it's difficult, right? It's like, you're not going to say, oh, I'm not for saving lives. But even saying the thing that was so controversial was like, well, okay, but what lives are we going to prioritize here? I mean, obviously we want to save as many lives as we can, but someone who's lived 85 years compared to someone who's 20, this is where the whole like life quality, you know, argument comes in. And it's a very difficult topic, but it's normally the topics that have to be confronted. But because people don't want to, I feel like they can easily be sold on like, I don't want to have to confront that. I don't want to have to actually deal with that. Instead, I'm willing to take a kind of more simple option in. And so I agree. I think, you know, these are incredibly convincing arguments because it's around health and it's around saving lives.
You've swayed my mind a little bit there already because I get what you're trying to say with because there is that idea of like, okay, right, you think you're saving lives, but at what cost as well? Like there is like there's a trade-off here, and you're right with the environmental movement as well. It's become very much like, okay, so if you're not supporting this, you're basically against the world's health.
Exactly.
So it's like, and obviously, who in their right mind can say like, oh yeah, no, fuck the world, like I'm gonna like I don't give a shit, like it's that type of thing that they're putting in a position where it's almost like it's so illogical or so unethical to go against this movement. But I guess you could even argue that's maybe I would love to see some of the other playbooks they were playing with back then, like for like Stalinism and stuff. I would love to see. I guess it is slightly different once again, but maybe this is it. The perfect trick now is like you find something that's illogically impossible to argue against because it's like if you argue against that, you just seem like such a bad person.
Because the same thing wouldn't hold at the moment, right? Like the argument against Jews would not hold because they've been part of society for God knows how long now, right?
But then back then maybe racism stuff was rampant, so it's more like okay, that's actually a very good explanation for all this shit. But like these days, our very good explanation is you got a medical system. Okay, we don't want people to be ill. Like I get what you're saying. Okay.
And I think we do medicalize and pathologize a lot today, much more than we did 100 years ago. And so medicine is quite like prevalent in our lives. We all do care about health. We obviously do want to live a good life and a long life. And so it's something that everyone can relate on to an extent, right? Interesting though.
Yes.
Interesting second part.
Yes, that's the second part. So I'll just give a quick preview of the next couple of chapters. So with chapter 7 is the leaders of the masses. So we're going into the leader psychology. Then we got conspiracy and ideology, which obviously will be going more into the sort of conspiratorial aspects, which we've sort of touched on as we've been going along. What else do we have here? Chapter 9. So we go into part 3 then. So beyond the mechanistic worldview. So chapter 9, the dead versus the living universe, which is going to explain a bit more about the alternatives to the mechanistic worldview. Then chapter 10 is matter and spirit. Chapter 11 is science and truth. And I believe that's the end of it. So yes, we're going to explore the leader. And then we'll be getting into the alternative to the mechanistic worldview. So stay tuned. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
And catch us on the next episode.
Yeah. That's a wrap. Hey guys, well there you have it. We hope you enjoyed that book summary. Now we know it can be a lot to take in all at once, so if you want to be able to read this in a more palatable size, or you want to be able to implement any of those key actionable ideas that we were talking about in this episode, head on over to our website at wisewords.blog, where the book summary will be waiting for you. Also, don't forget to check out our socials as we consistently upload the key ideas, benefits, and actionable ideas from all the books that we read. The links to those will be in the description below.
Now, we want to be able to get you the best content in a way that's really easy to understand, but we need your help. Your opinion matters. So you are our feedback mechanism. And with those quick actions, whether that's leaving us a like or a dislike, commenting in the comment section below, or subscribing to our channel, all of those help us gauge what we're doing well and how to improve on our method of delivery. So if you have any thoughts on the matter, don't hesitate to act. It takes less than 10 seconds and it really helps us out. But with all that being said, until next time, stay wise.